Welcome, everybody. I'm Ilana Reske-Kidd. I'm the founder and head of the Shefa School, and we're really excited to have everybody here. It is a very full house. So I wanted to just give a brief introduction. First, for those of you who don't know, the Shefa School is a Jewish community day school here located in Manhattan, serving students in grades 1 through 8 with language-based learning disabilities. It's really a school for kids who are struggling in other places, who have both really bright and curious students who struggle and who need a different kind of environment. Our kids come from all over the 5 boroughs, Westchester, Long Island, New Jersey. And I see in our room here, we have people from all over the country. So welcome to all of you. I also wanted to talk a little bit about the Shefa Center. This program really is through our Shefa Center. The Shefa Center is a place, it's a virtual place that provides professional development, consulting, partnership, and training to Jewish day schools, Jewish educators who are thinking about the question of how to work with their students who have learning challenges, who have ADHD. And we do that in a range of ways. We do that through workshops. We do that through summer trainings. We do that through consultation. We do that through events like tonight. So thank you for joining us. And if you're interested in other things and there are ways in which we could be helpful to you, please do feel free to reach out to us. The email address is center@shefaschool.org. You can check on our website, but really it's an important and an exciting part of our work is being able to help empower other schools and other educators to be able to better serve the students and the children that are in their midst. And now I really have the privilege to introduce my friend, my colleague, the presenter tonight, Dr. Yoni Schwab. Yoni is a clinical psychologist. He served as a psychologist at the Windward School and on the faculty of the Windward Teacher Training Institute. He's an adjunct clinical supervisor at Furkhoff at Yeshiva University. He's had successful private clinical practices in Riverdale and in Scarsdale. He conducts research, consults, and lectures extensively on social emotional learning, progressive behavior management, and raising the achievement of students with behavioral and learning challenges. He also serves on the expert panel of parents.com, which is a website of Parents Magazine. Yoni holds a BA from both Columbia University and the Jewish Theological Seminary, and he earned his doctorate in clinical psychology at Rutgers University. He also trained at the NYU Child Study Center in the treatment of ADHD and disruptive behavior, and at the Institute for Behavioral Therapy. He also did a year of training in ADHD at the NYU Child Study Center. Yoni serves as the assistant head of the Shefa School. He has been here since the beginning. He's been at the Shefa School for 10 years. And prior to his career in psychology, he also did some management and development consulting for Jewish and Israeli nonprofits at Perry Davis Associates. Couldn't be more excited for all of you to get a sense of what to learn from Yoni. And just a moment about the chat. If anyone has questions, please feel free to put them in the chat. Yoni's going to do his presentation, and then at the end, we will turn it to questions. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Ilana. If someone could spotlight me, we'll get started. All right, hopefully I'm being spotlighted. Yes? Okay, yes. Great. Perfect. All right, let's get rolling. So we have about an hour and change tonight to talk about ADHD. ADHD is a very big topic. So I apologize, I'm going to go a little bit quickly, but we sent out the slides. You have those for your reference. There is a page at the end. I tried to, the thousands and thousands of things that have been created and written about ADHD, I tried to boil it down to some of my favorite resources at the end. This is obviously a big topic that, you can explore for a long time, but I'm really hoping to provide something very simple tonight for both educators, for parents, for everyone who's here who cares about kids, frankly cares about adults who have ADHD, which is a basic understanding of what ADHD is. You can look in the DSM, and we'll look at those criteria in a minute to describe what ADHD is in terms of its symptomatology and how you come to a diagnosis. But that doesn't, for me, I knew those symptoms for a long time, and I knew how to diagnose it for a long time before it was really explained to me kind of what the underlying theme is behind all those different ideas. And once I understood that basic theme from Russell Barkley, who is an eminent psychologist, he has now retired after a long career of research on ADHD. When I heard him speak, it really gave me an organizing principle to understand what I had been seeing in kids and adults with ADHD for a long time. So I'm hoping to share my understanding of that with you tonight, and then how that leads into what you can do to support children with ADHD, and frankly, also adults with ADHD. So let's get started. So before we start that, I'd love to know who's in the room and know who I'm speaking to. So we're going to do a little poll, and let's see if this works. So 2 questions for you. You are a parent, caregiver, an educator, a professional who works with kids or others. So go ahead and start to fill that out. Hopefully you see it. And also who you're here thinking about. Are you thinking about a child under 5? You can think about more than one. You have a choice: children under 5, elementary, lower school, middle school, high school, or the child you're thinking about is actually an adult. Could be even yourself or someone in your family. So let me give everyone a moment to fill that out. We have 276 people in the room so far, so it's a big group. It'll be hard to have a real conversation, but I'm hoping with a couple of polls and interactive elements, we can all stay engaged here on 7:30 at night. I'm going to give everyone 5 more seconds to respond, and then I'll display the results. So I hope everyone can see that. We have a lot of parents and educators, about 50-50, actually more than 50% of each. We also have some other professionals and others. And the largest group of you are thinking about kids in lower school, but certainly quite a few under 5 middle school, and as well as high school and adults. Great. Thank you very much for sharing who you are, since you know a little bit about me. Here's the agenda for tonight. I'm going to define ADHD based on the criteria and based on how we as professionals think about it, so you can get an idea. Then I'm going to talk about that salient question that I presented at the beginning, which is kind of what is ADHD, or how do I think about it when I see it, and it helps me organize my thinking about it. What does it look like in the world? What does that basic understanding, how does that play out in terms of how the ADHD affects kids or adults as they walk through this world? How do we treat ADHD? And then, of course, helping a child / a little bit adult with ADHD. So let's start with how ADHD is defined. So here's my one trivia question for the night. I think this is a fascinating question. When do you think, this is a guess, when did the medical field begin to describe something that sounds pretty, they didn't call it ADHD, of course, this was a little while ago, but when did they begin to describe something that sounds an awful like ADHD? So let me put up your choices, and I'd love to hear what people think. Was it in 1798? Was it in 1845, 1954, or 1980? All right, we've got people responding. This is fun. And I will say, well, I'm not going to give away anything. I'll give everyone about 15 more seconds to respond. Your best guess of when you think ADHD started to be described in the medical literature. All right, give you 5 more seconds. Put in your last guesses. All right, here we go. Here are the results. Hope everyone can see that. Only 5% of you thought 1798, more 1845, more 1954, and many more 1980. Now, all these dates are actually salient in the history of ADHD. 1980 is when basically more or less the current diagnostic criteria were laid down in the DSM-3. Just over 40 years ago. It hasn't changed much since then, for better or for worse. And that's actually when they did away with the term ADD, which is interesting. People will still use that term. Officially, psychiatrists got rid of it in 1980. 1954 is when Ritalin was introduced for ADHD for the first time. 1845, there was actually a great poem written that sounds awful like ADHD, but the real answer, of course, is 1798. In 1798, in an inquiry into the nature and origin of mental derangement, by a doctor in London. He described a disease of attention, the incapacity of attending with a necessary degree of constancy to any one object, an unnatural degree of mental restlessness. And every public teacher must have observed that there are many to whom the dryness and difficulties of the Latin and Greek grammars, I'm sure those are very compelling back then, are so disgusting that neither the terrors of the rod nor the indulgence of any kind of entreaty, that is rewards, can cause them to give their attention to them. And this, of course, is from a medical treatise from 1798. So for anyone who says, oh, this is a new invention of the 20th century, think again. This is as old as time. So here's how you would diagnose ADHD if you're someone like me, a psychologist. There's three large categories of symptoms. The first set is inattentive symptoms. Here are the list, and you need to have at least 6 of these to get a check mark on this list to be part of the inattentive group. So everything from making careless mistakes, paying close attention, not listening when someone's speaking to you, or not appearing to listen, having trouble following through on directions, trouble organizing. Organizing, a lot of people think, is one of the ones, you can have any combination of these 6. That seems to be one of the ones that's most constant. Kids with ADHD really often have trouble organizing, lose things, distracted, forgetful. So that's the inattentive set. You need at least 6 to get into that category. And then here are the hyperactive and impulsive sets, and you need 6 combined across these 2. So, the hyperactive set includes being fidgety or squirmy, runs and climbs excessively, on the go, driven by a motor, or just even they can sit, they talk excessively. And then the impulsive symptoms are blurting out answers, trouble waiting turns, interrupting, and intrudes. And again, to get into the hyperactive impulsive set, you need to have at least 6 of those. So how do we diagnose ADHD? So again, since 1980, ADD no longer exists according to the DSM, which is put out by this American Psychiatric Association. People still use it in common parlance all the time. But what they mean is the following. So if you have neither enough hyperactivity and impulsivity nor enough inattentive symptoms, obviously you don't have ADHD, you don't have enough symptoms, you don't have ADHD, great. If you have enough inattentive symptoms, you're in the lower left-hand quadrant, but not enough hyperactive impulsive symptoms, you have ADHD inattentive type. That's what people used to call ADD, or still call ADD, which is attention deficit hyperactivity disorder without the hyperactivity. So just the inattentive type. If you don't have enough inattentive symptoms, but you do have enough hyperactive impulsive symptoms, you're in the upper right-hand corner, and that's hyperactive impulsive type. And if you have enough of both, you have the combined type. Now, here's how this actually plays out. Now, obviously, a lot of people don't have ADHD. The inattentive type does exist in good number. There's a whole literature about maybe it's a different disorder, actually. It might have a different phenotype. There are some kids who are just subclinical on the hyperactivity, impulsivity. So that's really the same group. But there's some kids who really don't have none of it, and they just look more inattentive and spacey and make mistakes and, kind of out of it. And socially, it's hard for them. That may be what's called sluggish cognitive tempo, which is a whole other potential disorder. It's not in the DSM, but it's a theory. So that's that ADHD inattentive type group, maybe some subclinical combined type, and maybe some of a different group. Interesting. And then ADHD combined type is by far the most common, which is you have some of both of those sets. What I will say is, interestingly, there's basically no one in this set. Like in theory, you can give it as a diagnosis, but the hyperactivity impulsivity doesn't really occur without the inattention. You rarely see it. And if you see it, it's usually in a very young child where you can't really tell if they're attentive yet, and they grow into the inattention as they grow up. A few more things you need to know. These symptoms is, if you hear all those symptoms and you put it against any 2-year-old that they sound typical, right? So part of it is that doing all of those things, being driven by a motor and being impulsive and not waiting your turn and having trouble, kind of holding your attention to something, that's appropriate when you're a little kid. So as you get older, it becomes inappropriate for your development. You're holding on to that earlier developmental level for too long. The symptoms, it's not something that comes and goes. It has to be present for at least 6 months. Have symptoms before age 12. It's not ADHD if someone develops these symptoms as a teenager or as an adult. If that happens, it's probably secondary to some other biological or emotional thing going on. For example, severe anxiety can really mimic ADHD in a lot of ways. Sleep deprivation can mimic ADHD in a lot of ways. And certainly insults to the brain as an adult can mimic ADHD. The impairment has to be in 2 more settings. This is not something that just happens in school or just happens in home. You have to see it in more than one place. And obviously you have to rule out medical, anxiety, all these other things that could be the problem. Ultimately, and this is what the literature says, that 3 to 8% of children and 2 to 5% of adults meet criteria across cultures. This is not just an American thing. It's not just a Western thing. This appears to be across all societies. I will say those percentages have gone haywire in the past few years. We're seeing much higher rates of kids being put on medication, rightly or wrongly. I see it both ways. I see kids who, may not really merit a diagnosis of ADHD getting that diagnosis because that's something so available to us. And I see kids for whom they clearly could get the diagnosis who haven't been. So we're a little bit of in a mess right now. I don't have time to really comment at length about the diagnostic mess that ADHD has right now, other than to say that if you're concerned and you're not sure, to really find a psychiatrist, a psychologist, someone who is really competent to really assess ADHD and be very thoughtful in thinking through that diagnosis so that you can get something reliable and so that you can approach it appropriately. Developmentally, it's very interesting. So the hyperactive impulsive symptoms, as I alluded to before, really come in first. As a 3 to 6 year old, that's, as a 2-year-old, you're going to see it in everybody. At 3 to 6, kids start to self-regulate a little bit more. And so you're going to see a separation. Some kids are just more hyperactive and impulsive in these toddler and early school years in those symptoms. Those symptoms, even when they continue on, they tend to get better by the end of high school. So this is really something, the hyperactive impulsive symptoms are much more a problem of childhood than they are of adulthood. Although adults with ADHD can sometimes feel restless, even though they may be able to sit, or they, have to get up after every few minutes and kind of walk around, but they have a little bit more self-regulation at that point. The inattentive symptoms emerge a bit later, right? You might not be able to differentiate a 3 to 6 year old in terms of inattention from his peers, but those are a set of symptoms that are much more likely to persist. So not all kids with ADHD grow into be adults with ADHD, but many do. And those inattentive symptoms, to some extent, often stick with them. Those are the ones that continue on, certainly through high school and often beyond. This comes up all the time in a school that works with kids with 1 to 8, is that the biggest gap between people with ADHD and others occurs in middle school. If you look at the graphs of when the symptoms of kids with ADHD are most different from how kids without ADHD are functioning, it's really like literally 7th grade. So it's really that middle school period where things get the worst. So you'll often see kids who are diagnosed in 3rd, 4th, 5th grades, because it's starting to differentiate. That curve is starting to break, and you're starting to see a bigger difference. And parents will say, oh, maybe they'll be on medication for a year, or maybe we'll treat them for a year and they'll be better. And I say, maybe, but not likely. The more likely course that we see in most kids is that the hardest period is in middle school, because frankly, everything's hardest in middle school. And then it gets better. It gets better to some extent after that. Whether the gap ever closes is different for every kid, but middle school is usually the worst. ADHD is really chronic and stable. So unlike something like a mood disorder like depression, which comes and goes, ADHD is like kind of a constant. And not only is it a constant in childhood, against a good portion, somewhere between 65 and 80% continue to have some level of impairment into adulthood. What causes it? So it's a little bit of a complicated question, but the main answer traditionally has been genetics. Unbelievably, ADHD is 80% accounted for by genetics, which is, by the way, higher than schizophrenia and depression, which are both about 60%. It's higher than most everything else you know about people, except for height. Height is about 90% accounted for by genetics. So ADHD is highly heritable. So when you see a kid with ADHD, you look around the family like, where do they get it from? And that's often when one of the parents or both parents will say, oh, that sounds a lot like me. And so it's really something that's largely accounted for by genetics. It's really determined by that. In addition to that, you can have ADHD appear in a child for other kind of basically insults to the brain at various points. A big one was high lead levels. When lead luckily is less of a problem now, except in some areas, but lead exposure can lead to ADHD. It's actually very hard to treat ADHD caused by lead poisoning, unfortunately. Alcohol, tobacco, premature delivery, different things can also lead to things that look like ADHD. In those cases, it's often responds differently to treatment, unfortunately, because the damage to the brain functions a little bit differently. The bigger picture here that I struggle with on this slide that I've had to add is like, but how is the environment exacerbating this problem? Like, why is it that so many kids are going on ADHD meds well beyond the 3 to 6% or 2 to 8, or so that 3 to 7% that you'd expect? And I'm going to allude to this a couple more times in this talk, but it's pretty clear that what's happening in our world where everything is so immediate is that we're taking the entire bell curve of humanity, right? So ADHD is not different from everybody else. Everyone has their own level of regulation and executive functioning and their ability to pay attention and ability to sit still. And it's on a bell curve. And some kids are more end, some kids and adults are one end and some kids are the other end, and most are in the middle. And ADHD is just one end of that bell curve. It's just like the most extreme 5-ish%, right? And that's where they're really impairing because it's hard for them to function. What we've done in our society, taken the entire bell curve, given everyone first radio and TV, and then computers, and then iPhones, and we've shifted the entire curve over so that everyone has lower attention spans and everyone has difficulty waiting. This was really brought home to me. I was sitting at lunch on Saturday with some friends, and we were talking about how some of them, they had gone to Israel when they were in college. And this was, of course, many years ago, before the internet and before texting. And we said, wait, how did I know? I had to find a place to stay when I got there. So I had to write an aerogram. Some of you may not know what an aerogram was. It's kind of like an envelope that you fold up and you put it in the mail and it goes on airmail. And if you're lucky, it gets there in a week. I had to write an aerogram in November, hoping that I get a response in December so that I could stay with someone in January. Right. So we all had, for those of us who can remember the pre-cell phone, pre-internet days, had to have a lot more ability to delay gratification. We had to plan ahead. We had to think through how we were going to get places. We had to have a map in our brains of where we were going because we didn't have GPS. We had to, decide what we were going to go to the store and buy it and not just order from Amazon and poof, it'll be delivered. We had to, call people and maybe leave a message on their answering machine if they even had one and hope they called us back. We had to write letters. And in a world where everything is instantaneous and we can't spend 5 minutes without some entertainment, it's not surprising that we all struggle. Oh, and where we don't read long form books as much as we read one paragraph of a website at best, right? It makes all of our attention spans shorter. And so what I think is our whole environment's moving in that direction. Now we've also compensated by making things much more immediate, and then that kind of reinforces the problem because we never have to wait. And the few times we have to wait, it's really painful. And so we're all kind of causing this entire curve to shift to the side of ADHD, but also creating a society where we can accommodate that at least most of the time. And when we can't, it's just intolerable. ADHD, though, is and what's going to happen on that curve is that the people who already started genetically on that end are just going to move further to that end and have more and more trouble as we move the whole curve over. So let's talk about, again, this is a genetic disorder and it has real impacts on the brain. There's been a lot of research on this. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this because it goes into the weeds that few of us are interested in, but it is definitely something that can be seen on brain scans across groups. It's hard. You can't really diagnose a particular person because everyone's brain's a little different. But if you put 100 kids in an MRI that had with ADHD and without, you can see differences. You can see where the difficulty is. There's this one image I think really captures it. This is a lot of what we talk about is the prefrontal cortex, not the only part of the brain that's impacted, but you can see the difference in development. You'll see at the top is the age of the brain, starting at age 6, and then how that area is filled in with activity over the course of their childhood. And so let me see if I can make this go. Hopefully it'll work. And let me see. Oh, there we go. I can make this go and you'll see how much more slowly the ADHD brain develops. So as you can see by 8, 9, you have a lot of that prefrontal cortex, which is the area of the brain that really, plans, is really been filled in and much more developed. And still by 13, 14, the ADHD brain is catching up and may never fully catch up. And now by age 16, 17, the ADHD brain is definitely in better shape, but is never fully caught up to those healthy controls. And so that's a way to kind of really visualize that this is very much a brain disorder. All right, we've defined ADHD, but how do we think about it? Now we're coming off the brain, and how do we think about it in our own day-to-day kind of like idea? And here's the metaphor, or here's the idea that really is stuck with me. So first we have to define one term, self-regulation. What does that word mean? So self-regulation, this is a definition, is any action an individual directs at oneself. So I'm calming myself, I'm planning, I'm doing anything I'm directing at myself so as to change their own behavior from what they might have otherwise done. So I'm calming myself because I don't want to be too upset and want to respond to this person. I'm planning something out because I want in the future to have a different goal or consequence. So it's in order to change the likelihood of a future consequence or goal. So self-regulation is the ability to work on oneself to change what our instinct would tell us to do, what we kind of like our impulses to do, because there's another goal. This is, like and we'll play this out. So what ADHD is, in this very simple idea, is a difficulty. It's self-regulation deficit disorder. This is a term coined by Russell Barkley, which is that the core deficit here is really impulse control. If you can imagine in that prefrontal cortex, and again, it's not that simple, but you can imagine in the front of your brain are the brakes, right? That's where the control center is. That, your intelligence, your ideas, your creativity are all over the brain, but you've got that control center right in the front. You have that's the helm. And the person sitting there, the brakes are weak. They're not they work a little bit. They're not totally broken, but you have to press much harder on them. They respond much slower. And so you get into a lot more accidents. That is a good simple way to think of ADHD from my perspective, which is that all these things that we're struggling with is just a difficulty with directing our behavior in a planful way, with stopping that impulse that we just want to do something and we do something so quickly. So let's do this in a slightly more visual way. Here's a model of emotion and action that I like to think of. It's very simple that I use with kids all the time. So there's a trigger. You're in class, you're at recess, and this kid calls you a name. They call you a name, and now you're feeling really angry, right? Your feeling is in your body, you're feeling tightness in your shoulders, and your fists are balling up, and your heart is pounding, and your thoughts are, oh, they're so annoying, they're always so mean to me, I can't stand them. So that's the feeling. You're triggered a feeling. Now what happens often? Feelings are what motivate actions. We think that thoughts motivate actions. No. Feelings are the ones that motivate actions. Thoughts just try to direct them a little bit. So that feeling says, oh, I'm so mad, I'm going to call them a name back, or I'm going to hit them, or I'm going to do something back. And unfortunately, that action may have a bad consequence, right? You call them a name back, and now you're in a whole fight, or you get in trouble, whatever it might be. So that's not great. What we as humans have developed is self-regulation and impulse control. And so we work to calm that feeling a little bit, to really address those thoughts, to think, look, what can I do to be more productive? And to interrupt that negative action. Say, okay, I'm really mad, they call me a name, but I'm not going to respond right away. I have to think what to do. And that gives us the space, that calming, that thinking through, that self-regulation to make a different action that has a better outcome. We do this all the time. When we decide, if we're going to eat that dessert or not, we have the feeling and desire to eat the dessert, and we decide, all right, I'm going to do it and go ahead, and that's going to have some consequences, or I'm going to use some self-regulation. I'm going to cut it off. I'll have a few pieces of peanut butter M&Ms, but then I'm going to stop. So that's what self-regulation does. And if you can imagine that self-regulation is impaired, it's not absent, but impaired in kids with ADHD, all that stuff goes away, and all you're left is with this. And that's what impulsivity looks like. They called me a name, I felt angry, and I responded with a negative action. Oh, and now I feel badly. And that's a simple way to look at it. So that's the basic idea. And let's see how this plays out. So what does this look like in different domains that ADHD typically affects? So first of all, it makes kids often very creative, right? If you're impulsive and you don't think, you're great at brainstorming. You have all kinds of ideas. You're often very creative. So many kids and adults with ADHD are particularly creative because all their ideas are generated and they don't necessarily filter them right away, which can be a really great way to come up with new ideas. And in fact, many of our most successful entrepreneurs and inventors and artists have ADHD because they're able to think outside the box, not having all that filter come and stop it and say, slow down, wait, is that a good idea? And they come up with many of their ideas are probably not great, but some of them are really great. And so this is one of those creative elements, one of those positive elements that comes of ADHD. And I want to say all these things cut both ways. These are, ADHD is a wonderful trait, and it's also can be challenging to live with. Weak impulse and control and inhibition, right? It's just hard to control those impulses. So, something is said and you have an opinion, you blurt it out. I'm in class. I don't think, oh, wait, I want to say something. I want 2 + 2 =, I'm not going to raise my hand, wait for the teacher to call on me. 4. I know 2 + 2. I'm going to yell out 4. I forgot I'm supposed to raise my hand. It's hard to sustain attention. If something's boring and not interesting, it's really hard to pay attention to it because it's like, pay attention for a minute, but then my brain's thinking, oh, look out there. Oh, there's something outside. Oh, the fire truck. Oh, I'm hungry. Oh, and you get distracted. But also, interestingly, kids with ADHD, and this is something that people are often surprised by. They say, well, my kid can't have ADHD because they play video games. They're really focused. People with ADHD can be hyper-focused. In fact, people with ADHD can pay better attention than people without ADHD to something that they are passionate or interested in. Let's think about why, right? That lack of self-regulation and that desire to focus on the most salient thing in the environment means that when something's boring or uninteresting, it's very hard for me to sustain attention because my emotions are pulling me in a different direction. I want to look outside at the window at the fire truck, or I want to talk to my friend, or I want to pet my dog, or I want to play a video game. But when the most salient thing is something that I'm actually doing, then I can put all of my attention into it and I can hyper focus on it. Michael Phelps, one of the most famous people with ADHD, is a famous swimmer. He described how one of the ways he was able to be so good is he loved swimming, and he practiced swimming more than anybody else. He practiced 7 days a week because he was hyper focused on it. No one else could sustain that level of attention, but he was really passionate about it. Of course, after he won his 8 gold medals, the first Olympics, he got really bored of it and he had trouble practicing because all of a sudden it was hard to sustain his attention because he'd attained his goal. So ADHD, the attention deficit hyperactivity disorder is actually not a great name because it's not attention deficit. It's really a difficulty with managing or regulating one's attention. You can pay great attention with ADHD. In fact, you pay attention to lots of things, and things that are really interesting, you focus in on them completely. It's that you can't regulate them and say, oh, it's time to put away the video game. Now let me go do my boring homework. That is extremely hard to do. So that's an example of really shifting and transitioning. You can imagine, right? You think of this as a young child, but even, older children, even adults with ADHD, when they're really interested in something and they're in a certain set and they're focused and they're busy with something, to transition on demand and say, oh no, it's time to put away the toys, or oh no, it's time to start talking to your friends and come into class. That shift is much harder because, again, I'm drawn to what I really want in the moment. I'm like living for the moment. I'm having a great time. And shifting and transitioning is not something my brain wants to do. So what does hyperactivity have to do with this? Well, if you think of movement, if you think of hyperactivity as impulsivity of movement, it also fits into this theme. So the reason posited by this theory that kids who have ADHD can often be hyperactive and move around and have trouble sitting still is that they don't have that same stopping mechanism. There isn't the same brake around their movement. So they constantly want to be moving around and jumping around and going in different places and fascinating. Oh, let's look over there. What's going on over here? Let me talk to my friend. Sitting in one place in class for a whole period to focus on math is really challenging because I have that impulsivity of movement. And before I know it, I've popped up out of my seat. This also affects their perception of time. Kids with ADHD really struggle with time and often are called time blind, not completely blind, but definitely hard to see hard to see time, because everything for ADHD is now. Everything's now. I am motivated by my feelings and my interests and my focus right now. And so to think that I'm going to wait for something is really challenging, or even to have a perception of how long something is. My sense of time is also skewed because I'm so focused on the now, like I don't know what 5 minutes means. It's very hard for me to have that sense and can find it very hard. And we'll lead to another example in a moment. It also leads to executive dysfunction. It's very hard to organize. Organizing, first of all, is typically boring, unless I've met a few kids with ADHD who really love organizing, and that's their passion, and then they become hyper organized. But for most kids, it's very hard to focus on it. And also their brain doesn't work in that orderly way, right? So they're both hard to be planful, which is part of organizing, and also hard to really organize your thinking in a way that would say, this binder is really a mess. Let me think of a thoughtful way to put this together. That's generally not how their brain works. And we're going to go more into that. Kristen, my colleague Kristen Vierig, is going to really go into this in more depth at our next session in March. So please come back for executive dysfunction and what to do about that. I'm alluding to it, but there's certainly more to come. By the way, all kids with ADHD have some level of executive dysfunction, but there are people with executive dysfunction who don't have ADHD. So to be continued. Coming back to the time issue, delay of gratification is a fascinating example. So this is a picture depicting the famous marshmallow study that was done in the 60s by Albert Bandura. And the idea here was, if the child can wait, a 4-year-old can wait sitting in front of a marshmallow until the researcher comes back, they can have 2. So there's a real motivation to wait and not eat the marshmallow, because then you get double the marshmallows. Kids with ADHD struggle with this much more so than the average. Now, we all struggle with this, right? We all have what's called a reinforcement gradient, which is that things that are happening now are much more valuable than something that happens in the future. Say, for example, I said to you, you know what? I'll give you $10 today, or I'll give you $10 tomorrow, or $20 tomorrow. You'd say, oh, $10 today, $20. I'll take $20 tomorrow. Great. What if I said I'll give you $10 today, I'll give you $20 in a month? All right, still probably take $10 today. What if I said I'll give you $10 today, I'll give you $20 in a year? Well, a year, what am I gonna do with $20 in a year? What if I said I'll give you $10 today and $12 in a year? I'll forget it. I'll just take $10 today. We all look at that gradient and say, well, now is more valuable to me than later. This is why, again, we eat dessert even when we're on a diet, because now the taste is more valuable than the later, which is, often, and we often fight that impulse of just doing what we want to do in the moment. For kids with ADHD, that gradient is much steeper. The now is even more intense. Oh, I'm so mad at her. I want to just get her back. That now is so important that, later on I'm going to get in trouble and it's going to harm my relationships and I'm going to feel really guilty. That's really delayed. Kids with ADHD, in many ways, when we talk about being mindful and present in the moment, they're wired for that. And the harder part is that our society is so set up around delay of gratification, everything from not hitting someone and, finding a way to negotiate, to saving money for later, to, working hard in middle and high school so you can go to good college. Those are huge delay of gratification tasks that don't happen in other species, and that are very hard, extra hard it's hard for all of us to do it, but particularly hard for kids and adults with ADHD to do. Kids with ADHD struggle with working memory. That's the memory. That's the space in your brain for working on stuff. That's the space where you hold a few things in your brain so you can manipulate them. And the reason they struggle, or one idea about they struggle, is that the attention just falls out. Like they have trouble, their brain's bouncing around to different ideas and focus on different things. The things kind of fall out much more quickly, and they have trouble manipulating those ideas. That can get in the way of some kids have difficulty with math, or they might have difficulty with memory games like this, and so forth. Part of the diagnostic criteria for many years of ADHD, which was strangely taken out, was difficulty regulating emotions, as well as motivation and arousal. Those people who are experts in ADHD wonder why that is, because it seems to be a hallmark of ADHD, particularly those who are combined type and have the hyperactive impulsive part, which is that they're also impulsive about their emotions and they react very strongly. And as you can see, even from my model, emotions are core to it. And so having those reactions are very common. And, Calvin, who is perhaps one of the best, the most famous cartoon characters with ADHD, even has a depiction of that in this slide. So I've talked to you about some of those impacts of kids with ADHD and adults. And all of these things, and I've pointed out in some cases how they can be a strength, and in some cases they can make it really hard. But I'm curious if people would open the chat and first start with the Shefa of kids with ADHD. We talk about Shefa. Shefa means abundance. And we really focus on the abundance of each child in our school and each child that we work with. And what do you find abundant? What do you find wonderful? What do you love about kids with ADHD? So if you'd open the chat, I'll give everyone a moment. We'll just do a quick chat, storm. Brilliance, passion, creativity, hyper-focus, energy, fun, out-of-the-box thinking. I'm not even gonna catch them all. They can all be very smart, true, spirited. They're honest about their feelings. Their sense of humor, for sure. Charisma. Yes, a lot of people with charisma have ADHD. Humor, frustration. I'm not sure frustration is on the bright side, but it's certainly there. Their spontaneity. That's a great one. Sensitivity. Yes, they really notice things. Authenticity. No filters. Love it. Their uniqueness, excitement, joy. They're able to think out of the box. Their honesty. Their empathy. Great. Sweetness. There is a certain innocence to some kids with ADHD who really are, like, oh, let's just do it. Kind of like almost like a younger child in certain ways. I mean that in a good way. They don't, they let go of things. They're upset for now and then they move on. Caring, awesome. They do have big personalities very often. Great. You can keep them coming. And now I'm going to ask the flip side, which is, what do you think now? Think about this. What's really challenging for a child or with ADHD, either at home or in a classroom or in your setting, wherever that is? Like, what do you think? What do you see as being very challenging? Impulse control, rigidity, yeah, because they have trouble shifting, transitions, reading, yes. Oh, wow, you're going too fast for me. Inability to shift gears, needing redirection, heart focus, self-control, their defiance, getting to do homework, calming down, all true. I will say this, and keep them coming. One of my teachers about ADHD said, if you know one kid with ADHD, you know one kid with ADHD. Kids with ADHD and adults with ADHD are people. They're people first, and they're each unique. and their constellation of strengths and their constellation of challenges and their constellation of what ADHD looks like is unique. Obviously, they form a group that we can talk about, but some of these apply to some kids and don't apply to others. The fear of failure, difficulties, they're very chatty. It's hard with other siblings, for sure. Awesome. Keep them coming. These are great. What are some of the problems associated with ADHD? I'm going to spend a little bit of time on this slide, not too much, because this is a little bit of a hard slide, but I don't want to avoid this topic because it is important, even though it is a little bit hard. So some of these are things you might know, but some come out of literature that are pretty surprising. So a large proportion of kids with ADHD, ADHD itself does not entail oppositional behavior, but a large portion of kids with ADHD also have oppositional defiant disorder, or at least some oppositionality. And that is because after you're redirected so many times, it gets frustrating and you're like, oh, I'm just going to do what I want. And so that looks more oppositional. That's not surprising. Learning disabilities are highly comorbid with ADHD. We think it's about 50% of kids with ADHD have a learning disability, and vice versa. About 50% of kids with learning disabilities also have ADHD. We certainly see that at Shefa. Low self-esteem. There's a high rate of depression. That depression does not appear before puberty at any particular rate, but it is higher after puberty because in many cases it's just harder to live with ADHD. And at a certain point it wears you down and makes you feel bad, unfortunately. And that often leads to substance dependence and abuse. The rates of substance dependence and abuse for teens and adults with ADHD is painfully high, often self-medicating and dealing with that low self-esteem and depression, and obviously responding to impulsivity. I was fascinated to see that actually the obesity rates are high. We think of kids with ADHD as bouncy and not eating, but actually the obesity rates beyond childhood and adulthood and beyond, and teenhood and adulthood are actually higher for kids with ADHD because they're impulsively eating and that's what they want, have trouble self-regulating. Eating disorders are also higher. There's excessive internet use and addiction, and I see this all the time. I'm actually surprised it's only 34% because I see it consistently. So many parents it's just so exhausting to parent a kid with ADHD. It's really tiring. And it's very easy to say, okay, here, take the iPad, go on the Xbox, like, here's your phone, give me I need a break. But because of the way the ADHD functions, it actually, it's a negative feedback loop. And you actually get more into it, you get more addicted to it, more stuck in it. And really that's the only thing that'll hold your attention at a certain point. And so unfortunately, the best course in the short run, it's like, oh, I just need you to calm down and use this. But in the long run, it's actually worse for kids to use a lot of internet. And actually, it should really be minimized for kids with ADHD because it can exacerbate those symptoms pretty severely. Over time, kids with ADHD have much lower educational occupational attainment. Only about 5% are estimated to complete college, unfortunately, because it's all that delay of gratification. Relationship issues, higher rates of divorce, higher rates of relationship conflict, higher rates of risky sexual behavior and sexually transmitted infections. Interestingly, a higher rate of diabetes, heart disease, chronic illness, probably as an accumulation of all the things above that contribute to all of those health outcomes. They're more accident prone. There's about 4 times the number of accidents, particularly for untreated ADHD. So if you have a teenager who's learning to drive and they have ADHD, make sure that if they should be taking medication probably because their likelihood of getting to an accident is about 4 times the average teenager, which is already high. And this is the most painful one that I read recently, which is a shorter life expectancy. If you add up all the things above, it predicts and ends up with a life expectancy for people with ADHD that's on average 9 to 13 years shorter than people without ADHD. The good news is that it is significantly improved for those who have non-persistent ADHD, meaning that it either doesn't stick around or it's well treated. And so we do know that treatment provides a lot of protection, not complete protection, but a lot of protection against these unfortunate correlations. So let's talk about how we treat it, because obviously these are concerning outcomes that can be, not for everybody, but can be for some kids with ADHD. So there's a few pieces to it. One is education and advocacy. You're doing that right now. Learn it, understand it, talk to your kid about it when they're old enough, advocate for your child in school, really, and have empathy for it, because it's really hard for the kid and it's hard for you. Medication. Medication is the frontline treatment. For better or for worse, we psychologists, I do not prescribe medication. I'm a PhD, not an MD. And I didn't go into this to do medication, but the research is very clear. Medication is far more effective for treating the core symptoms of ADHD than anything we psychologists have come up with. So we're going to talk about that for a minute. Behavioral, but they should be paired with behavioral interventions, which can be supportive, not of the core symptoms of ADHD, but with all the effects of it. The behavioral stuff, functioning in school, et cetera. And there are also summer treatment programs that have been found to be pretty effective in helping kids to learn some regulation and to function better in school during the year and behave better. A friend of mine at Richard Gallagher at NYU developed a program called Organizational Skills Training, which has shown really strong effectiveness for kids with ADHD, particularly in elementary school, to teach them how to organize themselves. So that's something that you can do in treatment. We at Shefa actually do it for everybody. Social skill, even though not everyone has ADHD, it really benefits everybody. Social thinking and social skills training. There's a mixed literature on how effective social skills training is. But we know that for kids with social skills deficits, there's really no other alternative. And so they really talk good skills training. Social thinking is a program that's actually, considered one of the better ones. That has some, at least, correlation with programs that, with what the research says should be effective. So it really focuses on our own awareness in a social situation, and then direct instruction of how we do specific skills. And then it needs to be prompted and reinforced in place in school. And all these treatments really don't cure. There's no cure for ADHD, but you can certainly live with it. It's a chronic condition, but it can definitely be managed and live over time. And kids and adults with ADHD can really thrive and be incredibly successful and use those strengths that ADHD brings them and the other strengths they bring to the table to really have a wonderful life. So it's important to treat and not to ignore it, and really with the focus on how do we help this child to flourish, because we know they can.
Yoni, can I just interrupt for 1 second? Because I think the question, I just want to make sure you clarify. The question was that are the stats the same for people who are being treated with meds and therapy? So I just want you to underline that question.
Many of the, I'll go back to the stats. The literature does not have there's not a good way to track who's on meds and who, meds or treatment or behavioral. Like, there's not a good way to track it. And also a lot of these are from treatment of cohorts of people who largely weren't treated because treatments weren't available. And so it's hard to track that. We do know in smaller order studies that kids who are treated effectively for ADHD, these risks typically go back down to whatever they are the base rate. So like, there's some level of substance abuse in the world. Kid who's well treated for ADHD, you would expect them to have that level of risk, whatever that level, I don't actually know what it is, of anybody else, right? It's not gonna get better, but it's not worse. And that's generally what we expect. The clearest data is for non-persistent ADHD. That life expectancy difference, that delta, really shrinks for kids or adults who have been effectively treated for ADHD or whose ADHD has really abated. So we know that good treatment is definitely a protective factor. What exactly it goes down to, we don't have great data on that yet. Okay, a word about medication. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it. It is the first line treatment. It does have a lot of protective factors. We know that it not only helps kids function now, in many ways, there's a theory that, if I give them medication, they're not going to learn their own muscles of doing this better. It seems to be the opposite, actually, that medication, when given effectively and really managed by a good clinician, which is a whole other thing, has to be managed well, teaches kids the habits to function better over time. And so it actually, even though medications come in and out of your body, these stimulants come in and out of your body anywhere from 4 to 12 hours, and then they're gone and they're done. If you take them consistently and thoughtfully, you actually do develop better habits over time. And you can see there's really just 2 major classes of stimulant. Everything's either dextroamphetamine or methylphenidate. And it's just different preparations and different brands and different amount of hours that it comes in and out of your body. The most common side effects are appetite suppression, although that can actually usually be managed pretty well. You time it, you make sure you eat before, make sure you eat after, take breaks on weekends often if kids are able to do that, and that sort of thing. Sleep can also usually be managed, although those are the 2 most common. There is some irritability withdrawal. Some kids will have that, and then you're often on the wrong medication or the wrong preparation. Luckily, when you take the stimulant out, almost always you go back to baseline. And so it's not, like we experimented, that didn't look good, or sometimes you have to wait a couple of weeks and let them adjust to it, and then it looks better. Tics can sometimes be exacerbated by ADHD, and sometimes it's the opposite. It actually helps them control ADHD. That's a little bit more complicated. But what I always advise, get a really, really strong clinician Psychiatrists, preferably. Sometimes neurologists do it. Psychiatrists are usually better at it. Pediatricians, even less so, who can really help you manage and be thoughtful and hold your hand and go slow and figure out what's going to work best for your child. There are also non-stimulant options that don't have a lot of those negative side effects. They're also not as powerfully effective. And so often they're used more as an adjunct, but they can be used as a replacement if, for whatever reason, stimulant is not tolerated. Strattera, guanfacine are the most common, clonidine a little bit less. Omega-3 fatty acids kind of help everybody. They don't do as much, but they certainly don't hurt. Okay, so moving right along, let's talk about helping a child with ADHD, and then we'll open it up for questions. So here's some basics for everyone. Kids with ADHD are kids. And so a lot of our best practices as teachers, as parents, we just have to do it even more so. You know, if we have to be really loving and caring and attentive and be thoughtful about our classroom management or thoughtful about how we set limits at home, we just have to do it even more tightly because there's just less, you know, kind of freedom, you know, for room and for error for kids with ADHD. And I also say relationship comes first. I say this all the time. We talk about this in school a lot. There's no way, and I could do a whole presentation about this. We don't have time for that, of course, and this goes for every child and every adult. Nothing good happens if you don't have a loving relationship with that person, right? There's a whole research literature on how you really need 5 positive interactions to every 1 negative interaction to really build that strong relationship. There's a literature about how, you know, if the test I always give is, you know, if you say to your child, you know, hey, Sarah, and they say, what? Then they're expecting something negative from you. When you say, hey, Sarah, and she says, what? Then you know that you mostly are interacting positively and they learn to trust you. And so relationships plus, relationships really in respect allow you to really build on top of. And if you're really struggling and not sure what to do, go back to really making sure that relationship is strong, because you're gonna have to do some hard things to really support this child, whether it's at home or at school. Acceptance, understanding, and keeping calm. You've got to also care for yourself. So this is beautiful and challenging at the same time. And some humor, some understanding for the child, some understandings for yourself, some understandings for your spouse, and keeping calm and laughing it off. And okay, what do we do next is really, really helpful. And notice we haven't done anything yet. We're really just focused on our attitude. So in terms of the 2 basics, there's a balance here a dialectic between structure and accountability. How do you replace your child's executive functioning by just doing it for them? And how do you build independence and really strengthen their executive functioning? I'm going to give you a few examples in a moment of how we balance that. They also need social emotional skills and support. We talked about social skills. They certainly need that emotional support because life is going to be challenging and emotional for them. And so being supportive or getting outside support is important. We also want to make sure they're pursuing their passions and celebrating successes or coming back to their Shefa, their abundance. Kids need to not only be like, oh, I got to slog through school and do all that reading and that math that I hate. They also need to be pursuing things that they love and really celebrating those successes at the same time. And don't do this on your own. It's really just not, don't. We all need help. We all need help as educators. We all need help as parents. It's just not, even if you're the most expert person in the world, you always need to be working and getting help from someone else and really partnering to get support for that child or that adult who needs our help. So here's a few examples of things you can actually do both at home and at school. So chunking tasks, breaking tasks down. When you say to a kid in the morning, this is, a home example, get ready for school, that may be too much for them. You really want to break it down. What is getting ready? Brush your teeth. Brush your teeth has a bunch of steps. You might want to break those down into chunk them, make your bed, eat breakfast, get dressed, and visualize it, right? Put it out there so they can check it off and see the progress they're making, because they're going to lose focus in between and really chunk it. And you may need to prompt them for each one of those steps or reinforce them for each one of those steps in small ways in order to pull them through, because it's so hard to maintain that focus on this larger task. So chunking and checklists are super important. Use timers, really help externalize the sense of time that they don't have. You can externalize in ways that are visual. They can read a clock, great. If they can't, you can use things like a sand timer or this countdown clock to show them how much time they have left. This is how much time till the bus comes. This is how much time we have left in our math, to do our, to play to play at recess or to work on your essay. And that way they can really visualize the time and get a sense of it passing, and really, help to plan out the time that they need to use. Use calendars and planners. Again, you're visualizing the tasks that need to be done. Let's look at how long we're going to have to wait until we go on our vacation. President's Week starts on the 19th. We're going away on the 20th. How many days until then? Oh, we're only on the 7th. Let's count. How many mornings and nights is that? If you're in school, we are very thoughtful at Shefa because we're guided by the principles of organizational skills training to really break down the homework and to give everyone a planner that they write by hand in, and they have to check it every night. Their parents, when they're younger, will sign it. And as you see here, this is an example from 5th grade of different types of homework. And then not only do you write the homework and have a place to check it off, when will I do it? Right. So I'm committing in advance to how I'll do it and planning that out. Oops, went backwards. Check on their organization. Don't just hand them these tools. One of the things we do at Shefa is that we check, especially when they're younger, we check to make sure that they filled it out correctly. And then we prompt them, oh, wait, you left out this worksheet that you have to put on your homework. Let's write it down now. You check to make sure the stuff is in the backpack. And then at home, you do the same thing. Let's go over it together. Let's check that you're organized. Let's check. All right, great. You're ready. Let's go. Let's see you do it on your own. Over time, we pull back those scaffolds so they do it on their own, but we get them to practice this process of really managing their own organization, but we've got to really teach them to do it. Use a lot of visual reminders. Here's some classroom examples of things that are in many of our classrooms. On the upper left is a child. Let's see if we can see it. Oh, here. On the upper left is is listening position. This is what you should look like when you're listening to what's going on in class, when someone else is speaking, the teacher or another student. This is what we look like when we're raising our hand. Let's just point to it. Let's remind ourselves of what that visually is. Here's what you can say, lower right. If you disagree, you can say, you're wrong. Oh, wait, I respectfully disagree with Sarah because, and explain. Here's a reminder about the voice level. Instead of always shouting, say, oh, let's bring it down to an indoor voice or soft voice or a normal voice. What level are we at right now? Here are the rules for middle school. Let's keep that visual. We need to have a lot of movement breaks and mindfulness breaks. One of the things we have in our hallways set up by our OT is a movement area with prompts of all different activities you can do to either stretch and get an energizer, to do some movement that'll kind of reset you, or to do something mindful and calming. And we practice this, in class. And you practice this when you're calm. You don't practice it when you're already upset or you're distracted. You practice it when things are going well. So that way, when it's over practiced and you really need it, you can then put it into practice. We switch tasks frequently. We don't say, oh, we're just going to sit and do the same thing for an hour and a half. Well, actually, we do. We do reading at Shefa for an hour and a half. Wow. How do you do that with first and second graders who have not only dyslexia, but also many times ADHD? Well, we switch the task within reading frequently. And we also slowly build over time that ability to pay attention. But it's okay to switch. Let's plan that out. Let's switch tasks. Let's make sure we clean up the previous task and go to the next one responsibly. So how do we do that to keep attention and keep moving? Make things fun. One of the things we learned from the self-control literature, and this is with adults without ADHD, this is for everybody, is that if we just say to ourselves, oh, self-control is my ability to consistently do something that I don't want to do. No one can do that. It's really, really hard to just have that brute force self-control, no matter how much self-regulation we have. What we do much better at is to either put away and make inaccessible things that are distracting, right? People who are, I know I keep bringing the diet example, but people who are effective at diets don't bring junk food into their house when they're dieting. Or if I want to go to the gym, the famous thing to do, of course, is to put on my gym clothes before I go to sleep, or right when I get home from work. So that way, oh, now I have to go to the gym. I've kind of set myself up for success. The other way to do it is to make things fun. Oh, I'm only going to watch that show I want to watch when I'm riding the exercise bike. I'm only, or I want you to do chores. Let's do chore bingo to really make that more engaging. So you're not always asking them to pull on this pool of self-regulation that's very hard for them. In school, of course, this is doing things that are hands-on, that are manual, that are fun, that really engage them. Reduce those distractions. This is a slide thinking about all the ways it's hard to do homework, because the iPad's sitting on the table, because my little brother's crawling around and wants to play, because the dog is so cute and I want to cuddle with it, because, hey, look at those Legos over there. Let's be in a space in the home that's really as distraction-free as possible, with as little noise and little other things to do, so that even when I get distracted, I can go back, oh, wait, what's my work? Oh, yeah, I'm going back to my work now. And managing interruptions. Now, this can be at the dining room table, or this can be in class. And I know this is something that teachers really tear their hair out, and takes a lot of work. So there's a lot of strategies that we use. One strategy is simply ignoring, telling kids, like, if you call out, I'm going to pretend you didn't call out and just keep going. What's 2 + 2, class? Of course, the most impulsive kid's going to yell out 4, and you just pretend it wasn't said. Oh, look over there. Seth, you're raising your hand. What's 2 + 2? 4. Wonderful. Thank you. And then the kid with ADHD is like, wait, I wanted attention. I wanted to get that answer, but no one seemed to hear me. And then you remind them, don't forget to raise your hand next time. And then they raise your hand and then you call on them. Or something my wife has told me she's done with her 2nd and 4th grade classes when she's taught is disqualify someone from speaking for 5 minutes after they call out. The whole point of calling out is get everyone's attention and participate. Oh, wait, you called out 5 minutes. Okay, then you can try again. And so really helping kids to visualize or giving them call out cards and saying, oh, wait, I called out. I got to try to have that self-regulation next time and really raise my hand. But when they raise their hand, make sure that you're calling on them as much as possible so they see that that's a much more effective way to get attention. So we're an hour in, and I'm going to just, quickly go through this basics of behavior management and get to questions in a moment. This behavior management, these rules apply to everybody, but they apply even more so to kids with ADHD, picking your battles, being proactive, being respectful, explaining the rationale, even if they don't agree, giving a choice, and being predictable. This dance is extremely important for kids with ADHD. You have, this is and you can look at this later, but you have the kids who are disrupting and the teacher who goes back and forth and back and forth, giving them lots of warnings, and then they finally get kicked out. Don't dance. Give a warning, remind, you're calling out, limited choices. You're talking to your friend. I'm going to move you to a different seat. I moved you to a different seat, right? There's not a lot of chances they see very quickly because kids with ADHD need to see immediately the consequences of their actions. They don't need a big consequence. They don't need to be yelled at. It shouldn't be punitive because it's very hard for them to control. But when they see that simple cause and effect, it can help them to start to change and to self-regulate next time. Perhaps we can ask more questions. And then I'm going to not go through this only because we're out of time, but educators, please go through this list. Most of these things should be familiar to you, but all these things need to be done especially well for kids with ADHD. And finally, before we get to questions, I've just provided a few examples of some behavior charts that are used in school. Similar things can certainly be used at home. This on-task chart is particularly interesting. For some kids with ADHD, all it means is that randomly during class, you come around and you give a dot if they're not paying attention or not on task, and a check if they are, and you see which one wins. And you do that frequently throughout class. And that can be helpful for some kids. Some kids, really, it helps them to focus, and other kids, it makes them extremely frustrated because they can't do it. So it's something else to try. And now I'll take a breath, answer some questions for a little while, and then we'll finish up with some resources at the end. So if there are questions in the chat, or if one of my colleagues could just unmute and let me know where to start. Oh, Kristen, great. Kristen gave me a list of questions. Fantastic. First, are there statistics true for children with ADHD inattentive as well? So the statistics about the negative outcomes, I think that those stats have been combined across different ADHD subtypes. I will say that kids with ADHD inattentive type are less likely to have some of those dangers, but not all of them. Certainly, for example, if you think of accident proneness, kids with inattentive ADHD are also accident prone because the attention's the same problem. But some of the more impulsive things, like overeating, may not be as much of a problem for them. What's the youngest age for a child to be treated with meds? That's a very hard question. I'd say I've seen kids appropriately treated with meds as young as 3, but that's a very special case. I'd say that more often you'll see it more reasonably applied to kids who are in elementary school. So starting with 5 and 6, even that's a little bit early. I will say that we try to wait and see if things really emerge. And even kids who've struggled, they might have been treated when they were younger, when they were 5, 6, 7, and it didn't go well and they had a lot of side effects. Often when they're treated a little bit later, like 8, 9, 10, when the ADHD is becoming much more apparent, they have a very different reaction. The older you are when you start medication, the less likely you are to have kind of big side effects. It's not that if you have if you start too early, it's necessarily bad or causes more side effects. It's just that, the older you get, the more mature you are, the body just processes it better and you'll have a better outcome. So even if you tried it when a kid is younger and like, oh, it wasn't right, it was too early, coming back 2 years later, you could have an entirely different outcome. It's a little bit funky that way. But we do, I would say that the youngest age could be pretty young, but we do try, we hope to wait at least until elementary school in most cases. Why do they help with impulse control? Fascinating. The stimulants, when you see, and look, there's stimulants really act on the dopamine centers of the brain, and there are people who can answer this question much more deep ways than I could. And still, we don't have the, if we understood how the brain works, that'd be a whole other level. We're only beginning to understand the brain. But in a simple level, we know that the stimulants act to activate the prefrontal cortex in a way that mimics a kid without ADHD. So you imagine You remember that visual I had of two brains? And one was a kid with ADHD whose prefrontal cortex was really not matured compared to a kid without ADHD where it was more mature. And that prefrontal cortex, along with other systems in the brain, really manages this impulse control. When you then treat the kid with ADHD appropriately and carefully with stimulants, the brains look functionally similar, right? It really does serve to mitigate the weaknesses of that prefrontal cortex and probably other parts of the brain too. How that exactly works and what the exact mechanisms are is beyond me and probably something that I think researchers are still trying to figure out. But it really is like you can see it on an fMRI. It's pretty fantastic. And the stimulants are the most effective psychiatric medication around. They're just the highest bang for your buck. About 80% of kids with ADHD respond positively to them and benefit from them. And the side effects are more annoying than they are dangerous in the vast majority of the times. So compared with your antidepressants, compared with your antipsychotics, all the other things that psychiatrists have come up with, stimulants are actually by far the most effective and best tolerated. And they really do seem to equalize the brain to an extent. It's not perfect. It comes and goes. It's, but it mimics it. And with a good behavioral support, it can really have great outcomes. What do you know about vitamins? Some are said to have, some are said to be deficient in kids with ADHD, zinc, magnesium, vitamin D. The literature that I've seen suggests that when kids have deficiencies in vitamins, they can have symptoms that mimic ADHD. I would say similarly for other medical issues. For example, a child who has untreated, I'm forgetting the word for it, where they have glucose, where they are intolerant of certain foods, they have a certain allergy, and that can really impact them. Sorry, I'm blanking on the phrase, but anyway, they have a certain allergy that can impact them because they're not feeling well and they have trouble with attention. And if you're deficient in any major vitamin or mineral, that can have impacts on your health. But when you treat it and you give them enough zinc or enough whatever it is that they need, or you take away the allergen, that should equalize it and they go back to baseline and they should pay attention. When you do that with your kid with ADHD, I mean, yes, it helps that particular area, that particular vitamin to be in balance, but the ADHD is still present. And so it's good to explore that with your doctor. Although what I found is the vast majority of kids with ADHD, that's not the problem. So that's not the solution, unfortunately. It would be nice if it were. If the meds don't seem to help someone with their symptoms, does it mean they don't actually have ADHD? No, about 20% of people with ADHD do not respond well to medication, and maybe different medication or just behavioral treatments. They may have come to ADHD through a non-genetic pathway because we know that those are harder to treat with medication. Medications are highly effective compared to others, but still 80% is not 100%. How can you prepare yourself and and by the way, if your benefit from ADHD medication doesn't mean you have ADHD, right? There's some people who take ADHD medication and are able to focus a little bit better because they're somewhere in that bell curve and it brings them more to the side of the bell curve that may pay more attention. Don't recommend it. Not a good idea. I wouldn't, for people who don't actually have ADHD, but it can help to some extent with anyone's attention. But it is by far the most effective and it makes the most difference for kids with ADHD or adults with ADHD. How can you prepare yourself and your child before middle school so depression doesn't set in? Great question, super important question. All those things we said. So everything from having a strong relationship. I mean, this is key for adolescents. And by having a strong relationship doesn't mean that you're not holding kids accountable. The most effective kind of parenting is both warm and firm. So you want to make sure that you are both warm, connected, that you listen, that you empathize, that you validate, that you care, that you share passions, that you celebrate with your child, and that most of your relationship with your child is positive. And you're setting good limits so that they develop some self-regulation from those limits, right? It's very hard to develop self-regulation if there's nothing pushing against you. You need to have some reasonable limits that you have to, adhere to. You have to help out with chores. You need to make sure you're doing your homework. You need to make sure that you are reasonably kind most of the time. So all those limits and more are important for you to self-regulate. And so those are really important and treatment. So if, kids who have wonderful relationships with their parents and their parents hold them accountable as much as they can, but really are out of sorts in terms of their ability to attend, and it impacts them in school, impacts them with their friends, impacts them functionally in all kinds of ways, that can make them feel really badly about themselves. And that's where the negative self-talk and the low self-esteem sets in. And that's the harbinger of many cases of depression and all those other bad things that come after it. So that's why we really do push effective treatment, not just the here and now, not just because it helps them in school when they're in 3rd grade, but because we're really also playing a long game of really helping them to feel like they can do it instead of the world's constantly telling them they're doing the wrong thing. Best practice for kids when schedules shift and they get overwhelmed. So a lot of that is helping them to manage time and warning them in advance. So I know we do this with toddlers, but you got to do this with older kids also. So helping them as much as possible to be warned that this is, that they might get, that things might, that we're going to shift, we're going to do something different. In half an hour we're leaving, in 10 minutes we're leaving, in 5 minutes we're leaving. When things happen and they're surprised and we can't control it, validate. Don't get angry, say, I'm sorry, I know we had planned to stay at the play date for another half an hour, but we really have to run. And really talk about it when they're calm to prepare for that. What are you going to do when things shift? There's a client I worked with for years who really, that was a huge part of the practice, was just like, things are going to change. How do we prepare for that? And sometimes you practice it. Let's practice if we suddenly have to turn around and do something different, and really helping them to like, okay, I can self-regulate, I can talk myself through it, I can use thinking strategies, I can use relaxation strategies, and I can be prepared. When I provide my child with any time or checklist, he gets overwhelmed and stressed, and even feels harder for him. Any advice? This is the problem. And this is a great example, because I see this all the time. Kids with ADHD, they don't really like time and they don't like tasks. So when you're presenting them with a visual version of the thing that's hardest for them, they're like, no, don't do it. So the answer there is, as sensitively as possible, to break it down and do it and find a simpler, smaller version of a way to do it with them, right? And really introduce it in small bites. How do we do the timer just a little bit? How do we find a timer that's simpler for them to read? How do we give them more time? How do we give them control over how long? All right, let's decide how much time. I want to give you 5 minutes, but all right, let's negotiate. Okay, you can have 10. And that way they're a little bit more in control. How about you set up the checklist? Let's think about a checklist would be good. Maybe you're putting too many things on the checklist. My mother used to give me a checklist every Sunday morning. It drove me crazy because it was just too many things. Let's do 1 or 2 things on a checklist and get used to it. And so that you're really scaffolding it up for them to be able to use those strategies. Many valuable aspects of life, school, relationships, jobs require sustained effort. How can we help people with ADHD stick with these, even though they don't like it and it's difficult for them? This is rough. And this is actually, we've discovered, harder for all people, not just people with ADHD. So let me give you a few answers. One is modeling. We need to model that we are sticking with things that are hard. We are managing relationships that are challenging at times, that we are sticking with jobs even when we're frustrated. And it's not that they're just bad and we hate them and we're workaholics, but that it's valuable to us to really stick with something that's hard. And that modeling is important. A psychologist that I really admire, one of my colleagues once said that we learn more from watching our parents than from all their words combined. We learn more from what our parents do than from all their words combined. So that's first, is really modeling that. Certainly talking about it and slowly extending it. We build resilience by doing it a little bit longer, a little bit longer, a little bit longer. We also have a huge problem in our society with accepting unhappiness and discomfort, right? So, and this is something we all do. This is not ADHD specific. It's just exacerbated for ADHD, which is that, yeah, it's okay to be uncomfortable. And that's not a bad thing. Sometimes we got to do stuff that we don't like doing. And when you see your child uncomfortable, don't always swoop in and fix it. Let them sit with the discomfort, accept the discomfort, be mindful about the discomfort, or just be uncomfortable and cry it out. And have delay of gratification. Wow, we really got to wait for that and not give in because it's just easier in the moment. And so all those little practices over decades of parenting, which is this is a marathon, not a sprint. I certainly know that from experience. Is really all those little examples of let's wait a little bit longer. Let's sit with that negative emotion. I know it's really frustrating that your friend didn't come to play. Oh, I know it's really hard to wait for mom to come home. Oh, I know you really want ice cream right now. Sorry, it's not available. We'll try again tomorrow. And really practice that. And so they can really learn how to do that. And then finally, really focus on what is valuable to them about that, what they're doing, what passions they can find in that school, in their relationships, in their jobs. Find things that they love. I mean, people with ADHD should not be doing jobs that they don't love. They just won't be able to do them. But if they find jobs they love and find tasks that they really, their Shefa, that their abundance is apparent, they can be some of the most talented and effective people in the world. And so let's find what those passions and excitement are. Maybe they love in school, they love sports or art or social, let's really help school focus around those passions and interests so that can really help them to sustain. Will we get a copy of the recording? We are going to send out a copy of this recording. We'll have it available for a limited time in case you didn't catch anything. I know I speak a little bit fast. You can put it on slower speed. You can put it on double speed. You can even send it to a friend and we'll have it up for a little while. And the slides were sent out. We're happy to send them out again. Let's see if there are other questions. And of course, if people have to go, we understand it is a late night. We'll finish up in a few minutes after we get a few more questions. How best to teach kids with ADHD about how to make effective use of a calendar for planning, making play dates, scheduling activities, paper versus digital, any recommended books? Great question about the books. I don't know offhand. I put a couple books here. This is a good moment, I think. We'll do this in a moment. I have a resource slide. It's in your handouts. Here are a few solid resources. Again, I try not to overwhelm you. There are 2 books at the bottom, but also some websites that have some brief tips. There's this YouTube channel that I discovered, How to ADHD. It's an adult woman with ADHD. She is hysterical. I think she's so entertaining. And that's good because you want it to be entertaining and engaging. And I think her information, I haven't watched all her videos, but the ones I've watched have really been spot on. So those are some resources for sure. I think do what works. Paper is good when they're younger, especially so you can visualize it. But over time, you may want to switch to something more electronic, and that's fine too. But you really want to just practice with them, hold them accountable. You've got to keep doing it. This is great for teachers. Teachers, don't give up those planners. Make sure every kid is filling them out. That practice over time will be a skill that they'll thank you for. Or maybe they won't thank you for it, but they'll use it. When's the youngest diagnosis of ADHD? Yes, impulsivity is developmentally appropriate. It is totally typical to have all those symptoms at age 2. And then slowly over time, a kid with ADHD will separate from their peers. The biggest difference will be in middle school, and then the gap starts to close again. So the youngest diagnosis is probably 3, but again, we do that very rarely. It's much more so maybe early elementary school, and certainly by middle and high school, you start to see it much more apparently. My son always forgets his homework or lunch, etc. How do I navigate the blurry line of letting him learn consequences of his actions or treat him differently by accepting this as his ADHD? I think you have to meet your child where he is. So if he's really always forgetting things, then he needs more support. So I would definitely practice with him, check with him, and then make a plan with him. Like, how do we create a routine where you can do this on your own? Maybe there's a checklist that sits on his backpack. Maybe he can't, finish up for the night and go watch TV until he set up his backpack for the morning. Maybe there's a checklist in the morning before he packs his backpack to make sure he has everything. So I would definitely structure it in a way you can do that. Are symptoms and treatments the same for ADHD and attempted as well? Yes. The symptoms are not the same. You can go back to that slide. But the stimulants are still typically effective for most kids with ADHD and attentive types, sometimes not, but it's still similar. They may need fewer of the behavioral interventions around behavior because they tend to be less impulsive, but the ADHD treatment will adjust and really focus on the things they need. So the essence is yes, and they absolutely need the organizational skills. That's also applicable. So the short answer is yes. It sometimes plays out a little differently, but yes, in general. Schedules, calendars, checklists. Oh, yes. Please come back for Kristen. She is going to go in. She's the master, and she will go much more into schedules, calendars, and checklists and all of that. Long-term effects of stimulants. Stimulants have been around since the 50s for the treatment of ADHD. That's a very long time. And all the long-term studies that we have seen, we do not see negative impacts, long-term impacts of stimulants. They just don't stay in the body long enough. There was some data that some boys were shorter in height, probably for not eating as much. But when their eating was managed, first of all, they caught up. It was like a short-term thing. But also when you manage the eating by taking them off of stimulants when they don't need them, that doesn't seem to be an issue. There was at one time a concern about impacts on a rare heart event. I don't hear about that anymore. I think that was not proven to be correlated. It was kind of not correlated. So no, I just listened. I just recently did an update on this. I actually researched it for this talk, and we still, since 1954, we have not been able to find significant long-term impacts of stimulants on a population level, which is kind of surprising and probably would have come up by now if we'd found that. Is there value in brain mapping? Not really. Unfortunately, we don't have the tools yet for brain that are sensitive enough to individual brains to diagnose it. We can only see changes across large groups, right? Because each brain is a little bit too different to say, well, oh, I see this in the brain that must be ADHD or must be not ADHD. We don't have those tools yet. So though people are working on it, trust me, but we're not there yet, unfortunately. ADD and ADHD. ADD is just an old word for ADHD inattentive type. So everything I said applies to ADD. It's just not officially the word anymore, so I don't use it. I read an abstract that reported the elimination of artificial food, colors, and flavors significantly reduced the ADHD behaviors. I think this falls in the same category as people who have, like gluten intolerance as an example, or other types of food sensitivities, that if you take out whatever they were sensitive to, whatever symptoms were affected, and that could be ADHD symptoms or other symptoms, will get better. Unfortunately, so there's probably some portion of the population where that's the case. And so you want to talk with your doctor about that. For most kids with ADHD, it's genetic, and for better or worse, food colors and other additives do not seem to impact one way or the other. Possible to get the daily goals charts or on-task chart on a larger scale. Sure, email me and I will send you a copy. What advice do you have for parents of older children whose relationship is already strained? It's rough. It is never too late, I hope, to validate, to listen, to try to correct, to be warm, to find positive ground, to back off of limit setting and to pick your battles whenever possible. But it's obviously much harder. Most kids are still looking for relationships with their parents, and I see their parents are really making an earnest attempt. We'll try, and look, adolescents are also rough, and sometimes you're not getting a lot of positive, and the positive you put in comes back later. So there's no magic answer, but yes, it's still worth a try. How do you educate classmates about the neuro differences they see in their classes? We do this very directly. We talk about learning disabilities and ADHD. We do it formally starting in 5th grade. We do it informally for kids who ask before that. We believe in doing that. We don't call out particular kids. We just say, hey, you might see this, or you might have heard of this. And kids will sometimes say, hey, I have that. And, that becomes part of the more normalizing of like, this is something we all have different brains. Whereas a lot of, there's no one brain. There's 8 billion brains in the world. There are 8 billion different brains, and everyone has different strengths and challenges. Let's just deal with the ones we have. So we absolutely believe in being very forthright about that. How do we teach kids about ADHD how to make effective use of calendar? Okay, we talked about that. I think I answered most of these already. Okay. Your talking speed is great for shorter attention spans. That is the first compliment I've gotten my talking speed in a long time. I really appreciate it. Okay.
Yoni, I think you did it.
I did it. Okay, fantastic.
I did it.
I'm going to go back. If you'd like to, before you leave, you can fill out that. You can put in the chat the answer to this question. What will you try at home or in a classroom or whatever setting? What will you start, stop, or continue? And just go ahead, throw it in the chat. And you can all watch each other. And as you figure out what it is that you want to change, what you want to try, when you want to start, what do you want to continue from this talk, I'll just remind you of all these opportunities you have to engage with the Shefa Center and reach out to us. We'd love to be in touch. We'd love to help you out. Thank you all. This is hard work. Absolutely. We're with you. We know how hard it is. We know how amazing these kids are and how challenging they can be and into adulthood. And nothing here is meant to say that this is easy. I try not to give any simple answers. Everything I said is easier said than done. And yet we have a lot of growth mindset. These kids are amazing and are going to do amazing things with the adults and support that you're all giving them. So thank you very much, and have a wonderful evening.
Thank you, everybody.